Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator in-depth weather forecast. This video won't really be as neatly edited as some other videos in the past because I am kind of late getting to this and I just want to get it out as quickly as possible for the people that are being influenced by severe weather for today. So starting off with our SPC outlook and our risk for severe thunderstorms for today. For today we do have an enhanced risk for the New England corridor for New Hampshire, Vermont, portions of eastern New York, Massachusetts, into potentially a little bit of northern Connecticut there, as well as western Maine. We also have a slight risk that extends all the way down into eastern Kentucky, and a marginal risk extending all the way back into Arkansas. So a pretty widespread area for the risk for severe thunderstorms for today. So mainly the northern half of the eastern seaboard, including portions of the Ohio River Valley and even back into some of the Mississippi River valleys. We also have a slight risk for the northern border of the United States there for northeastern Montana and northwestern North Dakota there. Risks for today do include a 10% tornado risk that isn't hatched, but we still could see the possibility of multiple tornadoes for southern Vermont and New Hampshire, as well as northern Massachusetts and far eastern New York there. And this is definitely going to be a pretty big risk for our risk for severe thunderstorms for today. We haven't seen something like this in a while, so definitely make sure you are staying weather alert if you live in the affected region. However, significant tornadoes, although may still be possible, it is a fairly low risk for today, but multiple tornadoes are still possible, including the possibility of a tornado outbreak for this region. I'm pretty sure that storms are currently ongoing. So just keep that in mind as I do make this forecast, as storms may not have the same intensity by the time this video actually does release. So I may be a little bit late to this. As far as our damaging wind risk goes, we do have a 30% risk for New Hampshire, Vermont, for basically the entire enhanced risk region, where we are expected to see the possibility of some widespread damaging wind gusts. Aren't necessarily going to be significant. Maybe an isolated significant damaging wind gust may be possible, but mainly it will be the risk of some mainly more weaker damaging wind gusts, but still severe, that could do a little bit of damage. So definitely keep that in mind. On top of that tornado risk, this will also be another primary driving factor for the enhanced risk region. We also have a 15% damaging wind risk for that slight risk in the north there. And then for hail risk, we do have a 5% hail risk, where we could see the potential of some isolated hail. This is definitely going to be a risk that's going to be more so on the back end, but definitely make sure you are watching out for that if you do live in the affected region, because hail could potentially be large at times and also potentially damaging. So definitely make sure you are also watching out for that, even if it is going to be on the back end of this risk for today. We also do have a 15% hail risk for the northern border there, where we could see a larger risk for hail and the potential for some scattered large hail across that region. For tomorrow, we do have a slight risk for the Midwest here and into the northern plains, where we do have a 2% tornado risk as of right now, where we could see the potential of an isolated tornado or two, a 15% damaging wind risk with the possibility of some significant damaging wind gusts greater than 70 miles per hour and potentially even reaching 80 miles per hour for Minnesota and Wisconsin, kind of limited to those areas in central Minnesota and central into western Wisconsin there. We also do have a 15% hail risk with the possibility of some massive hailstones being greater than 5 inches, or sorry, not 5 inches, 2 inches. And then we also do have a 5% damaging wind risk and a 5% hail risk for a marginal risk for North Carolina and South Dakota, or South Carolina along the coast there, but not really all that much of a tornado risk. Then for our day three outlook, we do have a 15% for southern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, northern Indiana, southern southwestern Michigan, Iowa, and northern Missouri there. And then we do have not really anything being indicated by our day 4, day 8 outlook. Taking a look at our excessive rainfall forecast for today, we do have a couple marginal risks, as what is typical with the summer months, where we do see a lot of risks, very widespread risks for some flash flooding. We do have a marginal risk for flash flooding for the area of concern for severe weather for today, with a marginal risk that also extends down across the Tennessee Valley into eastern Tennessee and into central Tennessee as well as eastern Kentucky, southeast southeastern and eastern Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, including the New York City metro region, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, where we could see the potential for some isolated flash flooding. We also do have a couple marginal risks for southern Texas, extreme southern Texas there, that is associated with some heavy rainfall that may be associated with a little bit of a tropical storm, or not a tropical storm, but a tropical storm in the general sense of like just some stormy weather in the Gulf of Mexico. It's not actually a tropical storm, but we do have another marginal risk for Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, the Las Vegas metro region, and southern California there. And then for tomorrow, we do have a slight risk for southern Arizona, where we could see the potential of some scattered flash flooding, as well as a marginal risk for the Midwest there, where we could see some isolated flash flooding, and a continued risk for some isolated flash flooding for tomorrow for the New England corridor, for Maine and New Hampshire there. For day 3 outlook, we do have a slight risk for flash flooding for northern Illinois, eastern Iowa, and southern Wisconsin, where we could see the potential for some scattered flash flooding, as well as a marginal risk for the southwest again for Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, the Las Vegas metro region, and southern California. Taking a look at our 7-day graphical tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center, because it is now officially hurricane season, and that starts in June, we will be beginning to take a look at our National Hurricane Center in every forecast now. So as of right now, we do have a little bit of a disturbance. We do have a low pressure system in the Gulf of Mexico along the coast of Mexico. This isn't expected. Sorry about that alarm. That is from Radar Omega with a tornado warning. But that little X there does indicate an area of lower pressure, a disturbance in the Gulf of Mexico that could potentially form into a cyclone. However, it is at a very low potential of actually doing that, with a 20% chance of a cyclone formation the next 7 days, and it will probably make landfall. In fact, it probably is already making landfall with Mexico as of right now, and may lead to some heavy rainfall and the potential for some isolated flash flooding for southern Texas for today, but we shouldn't really see too many impacts from that over the coming days. Taking a look at our weather models for today, starting off with our 500 millibars and our upper level air pattern and how that's going to affect our risk for severe thunderstorms for today. We do have this trough that is moving into the New England corridor here, and all the strong 500 millibar flow will support a lot of shear and support our overall risk for severe thunderstorms. This is positively tilted though, so that could provide a little bit more of a limiting factor. However, as far as I see, it's going to be very minuscule as far as limiting that risk for severe thunderstorms, as we do have some pretty strong 500 millibar flow across this region. So quite a lot of forcing is in place to support that risk for severe thunderstorms, and we should also get some pretty decent speed shear out of it as well, with the 500 millibar jet that is going to be reaching upwards of 65 knots across this region. Keep in mind that our high resolution ensemble forecast system is a little bit more conservative, so in reality this 500 millibar flow could be a little bit stronger. This is just the combination of what all our different high resolution models are outputting. It's just combining them together to give the overall best ideal and what is probably going to happen as far as our severe thunderstorms for today. And for that other risk for severe thunderstorms in the north, we do have a trough that is moving into this region. It isn't as pronounced and it isn't as deep. It does seem to be negatively tilted there, but we do have a pretty strong 500 millibar jet here that is reaching upwards of 70 knots across that region. However, it isn't directly feeding into that region. At best, we probably have 500 millibar flow in that region that is getting upwards of 60, 55 knots across this region, and probably even lower. Definitely still going to support our risk for severe thunderstorms overall. However, it will definitely be a little bit more limiting, but still definitely sufficient in supporting our risk for severe thunderstorms, so definitely don't let that fool you. Taking a look at our 700 millibar flow and our low level jet and how this is going to affect our risk for tornadoes across the New England corridor for today. We are expected to see some pretty strong 700 millibar flow here. It doesn't necessarily look to be as as varied from our 500 millibar flow, which is needed for that directional shear in our curved photographs. It does look like our 700 millibar flow may be following that same pattern as our 500 millibars. We can also double check to verify that. Yeah, you can definitely tell that there is a little bit of a difference in our wind vectors there. It is kind of hard to tell. And it actually does look fairly similar. So we may have a little bit more limited directional shear. However, at the surface, with our strong 500 millibar flow and of course our strong low-level jet, of course that will definitely allow for our risk for tornadoes, as we do have some pretty strong directional shear, because that will probably translate down to the surface as a mass response with our surface low wherever it is. We do have a cold front that is pushing into this region. I'm pretty sure our surface low is somewhere up here, but we do have a cold front pushing into this region, so that will trigger our severe thunderstorms. So, overall, the directional shear may potentially be a little bit more questionable, but as far as our 700 millibar flow goes and our raw low-level jet, we definitely would have some plentiful directional shear in supporting our risk for tornadoes across the New England corridor for today. Taking a look at our 200 millibar flow and how that's going to affect our speed shear and our risk for hail, as well as our overall risk for severe thunderstorms with the spreading of our wind vectors. We do have a pretty decently strong 200 millibar jet that is feeding into this region with 200 millibar flow that is expected to get upwards of 80 to 90 knots across this region. Definitely pretty strong. We'll definitely support quite a lot of speed shear across this region, a decent hail risk. However, when we get to our lapse rates, I do know that other forecasters were mentioning lower lapse rates, and to be honest, I did not look at the models before making this forecast, which isn't wise of me. I do know that, but based on what other people are saying, if we do have weaker lapse rates and potentially more modest speed shear as a result of some still some strong but more modest 200 millibar flow across this region, we could have overall a lower end risk for hail across this region, as indicated by that 5% risk for hail. We don't really have the best risk for hail, but hail still definitely could be possible with some pretty decently strong 200 millibar flow. As far as the spreading of our wind vectors go, you can definitely tell that we have some pretty decent spreading of our wind vectors, some pretty noticeable defluence, meaning that we do have a little bit of a void in the upper levels of the atmosphere, which is supporting a very large amount of widespread lift in supporting a enhanced risk for severe thunderstorms for today. Taking a look at our storm relative helicity and how that's going to affect our risk for tornadoes across this region, does look like we are expected to have more than plentiful directional shear across this region, with our very strong low-level jet across this region as well, with storm relative helicity values that appear to be getting upwards of the 200s to the mid 200s, maybe even the 300s in some regions. I don't know where the 300s are. In between 200 and 400, I'm assuming somewhere here. Definitely some pretty decently strong storm relative helicity values. They're definitely going to be pretty plentiful and definitely very supportive of our risk for tornadoes across this region, with a very large amount of directional shear that is going to be extended all the way from Maine into New Hampshire, Massachusetts, down into Connecticut as well. Again, very, very plentiful directional shear will definitely be very supportive of a risk for multiple tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our bulk shear and how that's going to affect our risk for hail for today, we have some pretty weak bulk shear values overall. Bulk shear values that aren't really that supportive of much of a hail risk. We definitely see the possibility of some isolated hail, but bulk shear values that are sub 50 knots across this region, plus with the topography of the New England corridor, which could also be a fairly limiting factor for our risk for severe thunderstorms overall, with our topography potentially disrupting our winds, making it overall a little bit more uncertain. That's definitely going to be a playing factor and could also affect our bulk shear values in our risk for hail. Some pretty weak bulk shear values that are 0 to 6 kilometer. Definitely going to be supportive of a isolated risk for hail. We shouldn't really see anything too substantial as far as our risk for hail, but some small, medium hailstones may be possible for today, but that is definitely going to be a risk that's going to be a little bit more on the back burner of things for today. Taking a look at our temperatures and how that's going to affect our instability and how that's going to in turn affect our risk for severe thunderstorms overall. We are expected to see some pretty decent temperatures across this region, temperatures that are expected to get upwards of at least 80 degrees to potentially 85 degrees across this region in the deep red here. It doesn't really look like temperatures in the 90s are expected to extend up into the enhanced risk region, but we are definitely expected to see quite a lot of heat across this region. And depending on our dew points, this will in turn support quite a lot of instability across this region and be more than sufficient in fueling our severe thunderstorms across this region. Taking a look at our dew points and how that's going to affect our instability on top of our temperatures, we are expected to see some pretty decent dew point values across this region, with dew points that are expected to get upwards of 70 degrees here and the upper 60s as well. On top of some pretty hot temperatures, those two combined will make for some pretty large instability values across this region that will be more than sufficient in fueling our risk for severe thunderstorms. Taking a look at our lapse rates and how that's going to affect our instability and our overall risk for severe thunderstorms, we are expected to see some overall pretty weak lapse rates that are going to be basically nothing. If we have lapse rates that are below 6, then if they're in the 5s, if they're below 6, that is extremely weak and even limiting. So those weaker lapse rate values will potentially be limiting to how strong our updrafts are going to be, how strong our cave values are going to be. These weaker lapse rates could definitely lead to some significantly lower cave values that we will look at after this. However, this will also lead to a pretty weak risk for hail as well, as we won't really see it get as cold the higher up you get in the atmosphere, so that layer for hail development will be much higher up. So combined with the weaker lapse rates and the weaker cave values as a result of these weaker lapse rates and the more higher elevated region for hail development, we will see a pretty low risk for hail, and hailstones will likely be fairly limited in size and probably won't be as large. Small to potentially medium hail is possible, however, that risk is definitely going to be fairly low across this region. And as far as our tornado risk goes, we may see the potential for a significant tornado. It may be possible. We are definitely expected to see the possibility for multiple tornadoes across this region. However, these weak lapse rates, which could lead to less mature storms and be more limiting to our storms across this region, that is going to mitigate any further higher probabilities for tornado potential across this region. So we are probably going to be locked and limited to that 10% tornado risk. Taking a look at our most unstable cape and how that's going to fuel our risk for severe thunderstorms overall, we are expected to see some pretty decent cape values across this region. They are definitely going to be a little bit more weaker as a result of those weaker lapse rates across this region, with the cape values that are expected to get upwards of at least a 1,000s to some isolated 2,000s and potentially a little bit more scattered. This is definitely pretty weak. Definitely going to be limiting as far as our risk for severe thunderstorms, still sufficient in fueling our risk for severe thunderstorms and the potential for tornadoes overall. However, could definitely be more limiting because we do have some weaker cape values and may support some weaker lapse rates. These weaker cape values will probably limit our risk for significant tornadoes overall, but still widespread tornadoes are definitely possible across this region. Taking a look at our surface-based cape and how that's going to affect our risk for surface-based storms and our potential for tornadoes overall, it does look like the majority of our most unstable cape is expected to translate down to our surface, so we shouldn't really have any problem in supporting much of a risk for surface-based storms. We will definitely see surface-based storms and in turn the potential for tornadoes across this region. As far as our convective inhibition goes, we won't really have as much of a cap across this region. May see a little bit of some weak convective inhibition across this region, but definitely not anything that's going to be that limiting. Storms will definitely be free to do whatever they want, and the cap will be broken by the time storms want to develop. However, some weaker convective inhibition may keep warm air from rising at the surface just a little bit, and may in turn lead to more explosive updrafts. However, with some weaker convective inhibition, in overall a very weak lid on the atmosphere, that increase in risk, or that increase in intensity for storms will probably be pretty minuscule. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer instability and how that's going to aid in our risk for severe thunderstorms overall, it does look like we are expected to see some pretty widespread, some pretty decently strong 0 to 3 kilometer instability values across this region, in turn with some weaker most unstable cape values and some weaker surface-based cape values as a result. These 0 to 3 kilometer instability values are definitely good to see as a storm chaser in a storm chaser's perspective, as it will lead to a greater risk for severe thunderstorms and definitely aid quite a lot in fueling those severe thunderstorms amongst some weaker lapse rates. So these 0 to 3 kilometer instability values will definitely aid overall in supporting that risk for tornadoes across this region, and will definitely allow for the potential of some widespread, or not some widespread, but definitely a couple to a few tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our energy helicity index values and how that's going to indicate the potential for tornadoes across this region, we do have some pretty decently high energy helicity index values across this region, which is surprising for some weaker most unstable Cape values. However, we do have some pretty decently strong most unstable Cape values. Even those 1000s, very weak and very isolated 2000s that we saw, still definitely going to be sufficient enough in fueling that potential for tornadoes across this region. And with some pretty plentiful directional shear across this region, a combination of those two will still definitely make for a pretty decently sized risk for tornadoes across this region, on top of that strong 0 to 3 kilometer instability, aiding in that fueling of the updrafts. So taking a look at some of these soundings that we have across this region, one thing that I immediately want to point out is how weak our lapse rates are. You can see just how non-curved, or how non-steep the temperature line is here. If we were to have some greater lapse rate values, our temperature line would probably want to look a little bit something more like this. It's a little bit more of an extreme curve, or more of a steeper curve in the low levels, in the mid levels of the temperature line there. We also don't really have as much of a elevated mix layer across this region, so not really going to see too much of a cap across this region, as indicated by our LFC and our LCL being basically close together, and as from our temperature line, literally no capping inversion whatsoever. And this is probably a little bit more of a saturated sounding that I have here, due to those dew point lines and those temperature lines being fairly similar, meaning that we probably have cloud development probably not as much in around the 500 millibar range, as our 500 millibar is probably transporting a little bit more drier air. However, in the mid levels and low levels, and not really as much in the upper levels, may see some thicker cloud cover, so that may be leading to some weaker lapse rates across this region as a result of some thicker cloud cover across this region. As far as our photographs go, I do have some decent directional shear values across this region. However, from this here, this is kind of like the partial trace. It's kind of like it's viewing the photograph from the side. So with this photograph being like a top-down view of where the weather balloon moves as it rises in the atmosphere, this is kind of looking at the storm from the ground level, if you can imagine that. It's looking at it horizontally, if you can imagine that. The partial trace, it does rise, and it does continue to rise. However, it is not sheared at all. It is basically perfectly straight here. In fact, it shears backwards a little bit and then forwards, and we don't get into that classic supercell range. So this is a poorly sheared environment as far as speed shear goes. So we may have some not as developed storms. We may have some more widespread rainfall, and not really as much of a separation from our downdraft and our updraft, which could be a potentially limiting factor as far as our tornado potential goes, as any tornado that may develop could potentially be ingesting more cold air, more rain-cooled air, so that could be a little bit more of a limiting factor. But it's definitely something that is interesting here, with the fact that we don't really have as much of a speed shear value here. So that is what's leading to our pretty low risk for hail overall, because we don't have a sheared environment at all outside of directional shear. Taking a look at our wind gust models on our radar omega real quick, Just going to quickly go over to radar mega so we can look at our wind gust models. With the mountains across this region, it is kind of harder to tell as far as our risk for damaging wind gusts, because those mountains could potentially either enhance our risk for damaging wind gusts in some areas where some of the mountains may funnel some stronger winds and enhance those winds locally, and they could also make them weaker in shielding some areas from some stronger winds. However, as far as storms go, it's probably going to come down to more of how widespread storms are going to be than really just winds overall. It's definitely going to be a little bit more of an uncertain factor as far as the topography across this region. However, as far as we see right now, definitely some areas where we could see some higher damaging wind values, getting upwards of 30 to 40 miles per hour across this region. However, we could see some more influencing factors from our topography. Taking a look at our large hail parameter, based on that sounding that we looked at earlier, I don't think I really have to say much. If you just look at our parameter here, there's hardly anything as far as our large hail parameter. Again, hail is definitely possible. However, it will definitely be a significantly lower risk compared to our risk for damaging wind gusts and our risk for tornadoes for today. However, some isolated hail may be possible, but those sizes of hail will definitely either range from small to medium to potentially even very small, and maybe even no hail at all. That is definitely a very large possibility in our risk for hail for today, due to just how unsheared our environment is as far as our speed shear. And then when it comes down to our significant hail, we don't expect much from that either. Basically nothing as far as significant hail goes. SARS hail size, do have some areas indicating at least 1 inch. However, that is probably just the baseline as far as the hail risk goes, because 0.75 is just invisible here, indicating that we could see the potential of some medium hail, and 1 inch indicating at least the possibility for hail. But I do expect a little bit more of some wiggle room from our SARS hail size, because 1 inch is the lowest it goes that is visible. So that's probably just indicating just at bare minimum the risk for hail, that it's really going to get up to 1 inch. And then as far as our significant hail percentage goes, do have a couple areas that is, again, probably like our SARS hail size, indicating the baseline risk for hail in general, without it expecting to be significant, with some areas upwards of 50 to 60 to even 70% in some very isolated areas, which I doubt is indicating significant hail. It's probably just indicating the baseline risk for hail in general. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials of Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. If you live in any of the areas I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being. If you notice anything might have been wrong this forecast, or like to make a suggestion or ask a question, please leave a comment. 3 other channels I highly suggest you check out are One Nation Weather, Weather Watcher, and JaxonWX. The links to the channels will be in the description, and hopefully I'll be able to see you guys later this week with a live stream. Is Outbreak is expected to release on the 28th, and I'm so excited just like saying that. Like, I genuinely cannot wait for this game, and I will be live streaming it when it does come out. JaxonWX will probably join us as well in that live stream, so definitely stay tuned for that if you are interested, because I am more than excited for this game. This game's gonna be great. So just stay tuned for that if you're interested, and hopefully I'll be able to see you there.